Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from the Mosquito Western Traverse on Horseshoe Peak. Over here, we've got the Collegiate Peaks for some of my favorite hiking in Colorado. Today, we're going to talk about Vietnam. Joe Biden has announced that he'll be going to Vietnam soon. It'll probably be in September when he's already got a series of Asian summits planned. This trip was supposed to happen a few months ago, but it got canceled because of debt ceiling talks. Anyway, Vietnam is one of the up-and-coming allies in the American portfolio and a major regional power in its own right, unique among many of the advanced or advancing developing countries. Vietnam actually has a healthy demography, so even if it keeps aging at its current rate, it's still going to be a major regional power 30, 40, 50 years from now. But more to the point is they've got the attitude and the positioning that is necessary. Now, for those of you who remember your history, we had the Vietnam War, where northern Vietnam and southern Vietnam duked it out with the Russians backing the north and the Americans backing the south. Ultimately, the South lost. The whole place was integrated into one, but integration is a work in progress. One of the things to keep in mind about Vietnam is it's basically a barbell, with about 45% of the population in the south around Saigon or Ho Chi Minh City now, about 45% in the north around Hanoi, and then this long, thin, rugged coastal strip in between that has almost nobody. That makes the concept of political unification, even with a military occupation, somewhat difficult. And this is something that the Vietnamese are going to be working on for the better part of the next century. That assumes that there's no unrest. That assumes there's no additional civil war. Not that I think that either of those are on the horizon, but you can never guarantee it when you've got populations so separated. One thing all Vietnamese agree on is that the Chinese are awful. There's this park of monuments in Hanoi where they commemorate all of their fallen in their wars, kind of like what the United States does on the Mall in D.C. And there's a small, roughly waist-high one commemorating the 20 years of the American-Vietnamese conflict. And then there's a taller one that's taller than me, commemorating the 200 years conflict between the Vietnamese and the French, who are the colonial power there. And then there's a two-story monument that commemorates the 2,000 years of warfare with the Han Chinese. So there's no love lost here. And if you are looking for a strategic partner, it's hard to get better than Vietnam because the demographics are good. They're a great trade partner, very hardworking. Their educational system is probably the best for their peer class. 40% of their college graduates are STEM graduates, if you can believe that. They're attempting to jump over China technologically, and because of the partnerships they've been able to work out with American educational and manufacturing institutions, they have a reasonable chance of pulling that off sometime at the end of this decade or early next. So this is kind of the partner that you want. They also have excellent relations with the Japanese and the Thais and the Australians. So they're slotting in to the American alliance network surprisingly well. There's just really one problem. There's nothing about Vietnam that is democratic. It's basically got a Chinese-style Politburo and top-down leadership from Hanoi. And considering that they're in the midst of a cultural unification process, I really don't see Hanoi loosening that grip. And that's going to keep Vietnam out of the American inner circle of allies. But for everything else, it's a great match. All right, I gotta go put on a bigger hat. It's a little chilly up here. Bye. Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from about 13,800 feet on, where am I? Square Top Mountain. Behind me, you've got the Continental Divide with, let's see if I get this right, Sullivan Peak, Santa Fe Peak, Silver Peak, Revenue Peak, and Decatur Peak. Project for another day. Anywho, today we're talking about media and why we're all so uninformed and why propaganda is doing so well. Propaganda only works when you do not have a well-informed population. And for a population to be well-informed, you need multiple sources of information that are credible. Sure, maybe everyone has their own political view, of course, but we all have to agree on what the basic facts are. And media has to work from that. And that no longer exists in the United States. The problem started back in the 1980s with the fax machine. It used to be that every newspaper of size, so basically like Des Moines Register on up, had a number of roving reporters, several of which were stationed abroad. And the larger papers, and of course most of the TV stations, had foreign bureaus. And when you've got a system like that, you have people who are capable of seeing what's going on, writing stories, interpreting things. You have copy editors who are doing checks there. You have editors who are stationed abroad who are doing things. And you get multiple eyes on every story before it comes back to the home printing or the home viewing. And it goes through another round of fact checks and basically bullshit detection. Well, with the fax machine, we no longer needed that degree of staffing abroad. Things like copy editors went away. And by the time we got to the 1990s, we had email and attachments. And with that, we thinned down the numbers even more. By the time we got to the 2000s, most of those foreign bureaus were gone, and you just had a few roving reporters. And as we got into cost cutting because the internet was rising, we got rid of most of those roving reporters as well, and we just started using local stringers. So people were getting local insights still, but it was no longer getting fact-checked. It was being blinded by whatever the proclivities of the people who were collecting the information was, and there was never a backstop. Well, you fast forward today, and we now have algorithms that are writing our newspaper stories for us and that are investigating and scraping the web for things. And the fact-checking has largely gone. And in this sort of environment, it is very, 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 very easy for a charismatic politician to say, that's not true at all. That's just fake news. What I say is real. And you get entire political movements built around a person. In that sort of environment, news has a hard time playing bullshit detector because the factfulness that is necessary for an educated populace to call bullshit itself is largely gone, and people start putting their trust in a person rather than an institution or a set of information venues. Now, where does that take us next? Still on square top, but this is now Mount Evans and Mount Bearstad behind me, a couple 14ers. Where was I? Oh, yeah. Now, this sort of information desert, if you will, is not exactly a new experience. It's just new to the United States. In places like the Middle East, where you've got, call it charitably, single-party rule, you basically have everyone living in an information vacuum, and so the rumor mill becomes the news. And that's one of the reasons why the American experience in the Middle East over the last 20 years was so frustrating, because it was so hard to convince people what basic truths were. People would hear something from a rumor, it would get spread via email and Twitter, and that was the truth of the day. In Russia, you got something even worse because the rumor mill is augmented by state monopoly on information. And so basically, if you get your information from radio or TV, you're drinking 100% Russian propaganda. It's not nearly that bad here, but it's not great. With the higher capital structure of the United States, media is a business, and it's all about how many people you can get to watch your show. So it's all about making sure people hear what they want to hear as opposed to what is true or what they might need to hear. So Fox and MSNBC, of course, are basically opinion programs now with very little news. Companies like Newsmax are 100% opinion. Basically, they'd be very, very much at home in the Middle East. And then, of course, Twitter has gone its own way that has gotten, let's just call it colorful. If you're over 50, you might still be watching the nightly news, but as you notice, it's like 2/3 drug commercials now. If you are between 25 and 45, you're probably getting your news from Facebook, which is probably the worst of them all. And if you're under 25, you're probably getting it from TikTok, and all I can say about TikTok is at least it's better than Facebook. So the question now is, where do you get it from? Still on square top, that's Argentine peak behind me, another 14er. So where can you get news from? I think that the most reliable international news source out there overall is now Al Jazeera. They're heavily biased when it comes to all things Middle East, so I'd skip that section completely. But they've got this idea that we're new to news, and because of that, we should interview multiple people with multiple viewpoints and just present it to you. We used to call that journalism. France 24 is definitely in second place. They are one of the few entities remaining that still have global bureaus. BBC is probably the one that has descended the most over the course of the last 20 years. And Canadian broadcasting is definitely the bottom of the barrel. 100% opinion, 100% party line, and nothing to be seen there. Beyond that, you can always look to local news sources throughout the world. They will be biased, but it will give you a view that you don't get otherwise. One more bit as I descend Square Top Mountain towards Grand El Paso. That is that big open area. That's South Park. Like that South Park, like Kenny and Cartman and Stan and Kyle. South Park. Anyway, if you're looking for something a little closer to home, there are really only 3 national news entities that I think that are kind of worthy of consideration. The first one is the Wall Street Journal, but obviously they focus almost exclusively on financial news, but what they do, they're good at. Number 2 is Bloomberg. Not as good as it used to be, but they do throw a pretty wide net, and their coverage is even-handed. And then third, there's something called Straight Arrow News, which is a new project that is trying to bring contributors from across the political spectrum to provide nonpartisan views on everything from finance to international stuff. And if you go there, you will find a number of contributors, one of which looks a little bit like yours truly. So it's free, just like all these others. Well, I guess the journal is not free. Anyway, if you're looking for something in the United States, those 3 are probably your best bet. All right, now I'm going for real. Bye.